Welcome to the Israel Now Forum webinar series. I'm Maura Schreier Fleming, Chairman of the Israel Now Forum Speakers Committee. The Israel Now Forum is scheduled for November the 16th, 2025 in Plano, Texas. We want to thank our webinar partner, Southwestern Jewish Congress and Texans for a Safe Israel. Today's webinar features Olga Deutsch, Vice President of NGO Monitor. An NGO is a non-governmental organization. NGO Monitor was founded in 2002. It is an internationally recognized research institute that exposes the abuses of power of anti-Israel NGOs in government, on campuses, at the UN, and in corporate settings. Olga is sought after for her extensive expertise in the international arena, particularly the relationships between Israel and Eastern and Western European countries, as well as in Israel-American relations. Olga is a regular contributor to Israeli and international publications and a frequent commentator in the media on humanitarian aid, funding to NGOs, international development, post-October 7th anti-Semitism, efforts to delegitimize Israel, BDS, and civil society. Before joining NGO Monitor, Olga held senior positions in the private sector in Europe and Israel. After earning degrees from the University of Belgrade and the University of Munich in banking, insurance, and finance, she attended the School of International and Public Affairs of Columbia University in New York. Olga is fluent in Serbian, English, Hebrew, and German. She lives in Central Israel with her husband and 2 sons. Please use the Q&A Zoom feature to submit your questions during the webinar. We'll have time at the end for questions. And now we'll speak with Olga Deutsch and our analysis of NGOs claiming to advance human rights. Olga, first, thanks for joining us. You recently briefed senior members of the EU Parliament. So tell us, how did that come about? And what did you say when you briefed them?
Well, first of all, Maura, thank you so much for having me again. It is always a pleasure to be back. And Susan, for always being the leader in the community and for staying in touch. I can't wait to be back in Dallas physically. I love your community, so thank you for having me. Um, it's interesting. You were reading my bio, and usually, mentioning that I studied at Columbia University is the highlight of my educational background. But since October the 7th, I'm sort of like, oh my God, let's not mention that. How much the world has changed generally, and more specifically for us Jews. But to your question, I literally just returned from Brussels on Friday last week. I traveled basically to have a series of high-profile meetings with the new European Parliament. Just for your broader audience, because we are talking to Texas crowd and in the U.S., European Union is a union of 29 member states, right? Its capital is in Brussels, and while every country maintains its independence and its parliament, they each delegate to the European Parliament, members of the European Parliament, and they try to navigate from Brussels through European Parliament and the European Commission, which is the executive branch of the European Parliament, some sort of a common EU politics. Now, they are not a defense. They don't have a common defense policy, but they have a common currency, and they try to most certainly have common foreign affairs policy, which is most interesting to us. Now, last year in June, European Parliament held elections, and it took them a year to basically now swear in the new parliament, which is why I traveled now, because now when there are new members of the parliament and new committees and new that would be like the equivalent of senators, right? Heads of different ministries. I wanted to meet with them and raise something that is right now one of the most burning issues, and that is a practice for decades of systematic diversion of aid. And I say aid because it both includes the humanitarian aid, but so much more than that, by the EU to Hamas and other Palestinian organizations. Why is it so critical now? Because as we are starting to sort of figure out what will be the day after in Gaza, right? When the war is over, we obviously have to first see the return of the remaining 59 hostages. But once that is over, and once the Israeli and Washington are convinced that Hamas is eradicated, it sort of begs the question, what does that look like? Who governs Gaza? And one part of that is administrative. Is it the Palestinian Authority? Is it in some sort of concert with the Abraham Accord countries, Saudi Arabia and UAE? What is the role that Israel will have there? What is the role that DC will have there? But it begs the question, what is the role that the European Union will have? Why?
What did they say? What did they say?
It's important just to understand the European Union is the largest donor of the Palestinian Authority and the single largest donor of aid. Okay, so it puts them in a very, very particular situation and position because they hold, and just so you understand, right now, the conservative estimates are that reconstruction of Gaza will cost over $50 billion. Like it's incredible amounts, right? So when you put that in the context of EU being the single largest aid donor, it puts them in a very particular situation. Now, the most, I can go into details that I briefed the chairs of the three most important committees on budgetary issues, or in the States, that would be the appropriations process parallel, right? The head of the EU's delegation to Israel, the parallel of Kaya Kallas's office, which is the parallel of the EU's Minister of Foreign Affairs. But the really most interesting takeaway for me was, if before, October the 7th, you would travel to Brussels, and the EU and EU officials were quite arrogant in their position, right? Right now, last week, I was hearing a completely different tune. They feel marginalized. Washington and Jerusalem have basically sent them a very clear signal. You guys don't really matter. Washington has taken the lead, particularly with Trump administration coming into the White House, with the executive orders that pertain to a lot of our issues, right? Funding, aid, USAID, but also cutting funding to UN and to UNRWA, and insisting that Israel has a free hand, more or less, to first resume the conflict, right? Eliminate Hamas, and in spearheading the release of hostages. But it's more than that. The Israelis have taken the EU out of the equation. They haven't let them go into Gaza and even take a look at what is going on. And they have frozen issuing humanitarian visas, which is the only way that all of these organizations can come into the country and operate and spread aid. So between that and no one inviting them to be even part of the conversation, they feel marginalized. So
Has
there's
the
sort of
funding stopped? Has the funding stopped because Israel won't let them in?
So immediately after October the 7th, the EU, much like all the other European governments, froze funding and launched internal investigations and reviews because they were freaking out. They wanted to make sure that none of the taxpayers' euros, in this case, I was going to say dollars, but it's euros, went to Hamas or any other terror-affiliated groups. Then they wanted to renew funding, but some of it was renewed, but most of it packaged as humanitarian aid. But here's a mind-blowing piece of information. The EU has allocated last year, 2024, 13.5 million euros. That would be around between 14 and 15 million dollars to a Hamas-controlled Ministry of Social Development in Gaza to hand out cash assistance to Gaza-based households. I mean, it cannot be. Now, to make it even more mind-blowing and to put all the USAID related executive orders in DC, the USAID has been doing pretty much the same through two US-based organizations, ANIRA and Mercy Corps. to do the same project. Now, to go back to my Brussels visit, right? There will be a meeting hosted in Brussels between the European Union and the Palestinian Authority on April the 14th, so exactly 2 weeks from today. And it is no coincidence. This is because the EU is now trying to position itself as a broker with the PA. So they understand they don't have really a channel with the Israelis. They understand that the transatlantic alliance is really shaky right now, especially after Vice President Vance traveled to the Munich Security Conference a month ago and literally told them, you guys are useless and have no spine because you haven't taken leadership on any one issue. So they're now trying to at least say, but we can be the vessel and the communication channels to the PA. And for all of us operating in this industry, it's a super opportune time because now we need to be very aggressive in telling them, but that does not only mean talking to PA, that means conditions on the table in front of PA, because unless there are changes, fundamental changes to how things were done before October the 7th, then we're just going to go back to the same thing.
Did they even understand that the relationship of their funding contributes in a big way to terrorism? Did they even understand that?
Many of them do. It doesn't mean that they know or have enough of a political will just yet to address any of it, right? Because you see it back home in DC that it really takes a political earthquake to shake up a system, right? It's not initiating a congressional hearing. It's really coming and breaking all the all the glass. So none of that is happening in Brussels just yet. But I do think that continuous pressure from DC and Jerusalem on a political level, and then work of organizations like mine, like ours, and many of our allies can make a difference. And this is what we are doing. We're literally going behind the scenes and whispering to those on key positions that are receptive to the message, how they might be able to do that.
Do you talk about consequences as a result of if they give funding and you see terrorism and any other thing that relates to terrorism
We
happening
do.
in Israel? And are they
Look,
responsive to that?
all of everything that we bring to the table is based on open source information, which Susan knows this. I cannot say this enough.
Talk a little bit about
Open
your research. How do you do your
Yeah.
research?
So open source is just a fancy word for Googling it, right? I mean, obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that. We are an 18 people research organization, but it's a matter of principle and value for us to base all our information on publicly available and accessible information. Why? Because, we were approached multiple times to have AI operated search engines and big data and so on. But I want to be able to sit in front of those guys in Brussels and say, you too don't need intelligence agencies checking these guys. If I can Google it, so can you. At the end of the day, we screen their social media accounts, what they say in public arenas, their reports, their websites. We cross-reference what they publish in English, in Arabic, in Spanish, in French, because they're very sophisticated and operate in many languages. And then we document those cases in which, instead of promoting human rights and humanitarian causes, which is what they say they do, they actually promote anti-Semitic narratives. They incite to violence or, call for a one-state solution for the destruction of the state of Israel, or have bona fide ties to terror. Or, and this is the funniest part, this is what very few people understand. When we talk about the systematic diversion of humanitarian aid, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? You tell
It,
me.
it's going to
Tunnels,
it's
right?
going to terrorists.
Exactly, and that it went, they stole concrete and pipes and all these things to build tunnels, rockets, or, if you're very inventive, they abuse the infrastructures, humanitarian infrastructures like hospitals and UNRWA schools and so on. Very few people, including the elected officials in the donor governments, know that a significant portion of humanitarian aid goes to political advocacy. It's mind blowing. Picture this. In the last quarter of 2023, which basically is the 3 months following October the 7th, right? The UN launched an emergency appeal for Gaza and demanded the member states to raise $1.4 billion. This is mass movements of Gaza population, right? Displacement. This is thousands of rockets fired at Israel and Israeli military operation at its peak.
Mhm.
They stated three objectives that they would meet with this $1.4 billion. The third one was political advocacy. Can you tell me, did the Gazans need a women rights project in the middle of that? Or, fighting occupation? Because that's what it is. Political advocacy is a code word to these NGOs using EU and US and other funds, taxpayers' money, to lobby the International Criminal Court in The Hague, to lobby the UN, right? To lobby the US government to divest American companies, all in the name of human rights. So this is what we try to show them, that it's not just the physical diversion of aid, but it is actually they're waging a political warfare against Israel and the Jewish people because they want to create an environment and want to maintain Gaza as a highly radicalized environment in which a terror organization thrives. So you basically have two ways of supporting terror, right?
Mhm. So it sounds as if the EU is giving money that is unaccountable because it's going to other things, and they're also funding things, political activities that they shouldn't be funding. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. And it is part of the so-called Palestinian campaign. I call it political warfare. And I've been saying that since October the 7th, we have been fighting on 7 physical fronts, but there's an additional one, and that is an international political war front. Now, and I'm going to say the following line with understanding that it might not sit well with everyone, but while the physical fronts have taken and will continue to sadly take a heavy toll on us, none of them are existential.
Hmm.
We have a strong army and we have a strong, amazing people here with unbelievable resilience. Is it horrible what has befallen us? Absolutely. Has it been a horrible experience? I have 2 small kids that I had to raise through this whole thing. My little one, who is 7, still sleeps in the safe room. And for the first 8 months, every time there was a siren, we would run into the safe room, and then he would say, "Mommy, I need to go to the bathroom," which is obviously was, an emotional reaction to that. But we're not going anywhere. I don't think there's anyone to their right mind who questions whether Israel is going to exist in a year from now or in 100 years from now. However, the political campaign that seeks to basically isolate us from within the international community of democratic liberal countries and portray us as a pariah state, as genocidal people, as racist people, right?
Mhm.
That is the existential fight, not only for the state of Israel, but for the Jewish people.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's the propaganda that the world has been using against Israel. And you have all this research that proves that the propaganda is false. So, how can you use your research to promote your work? Is it partnering with any other organizations to leverage your work? Or what could you do to leverage it?
Well, it's literally all of the above. We do a lot of our outreach on our own. So, I maintain my own relationships with many, many elected officials and politicians and members of the parliaments around Europe and US.
Mhm.
We brief congressional offices since the new administration, particularly we have briefed them tens of times. 3 weeks ago, I was in Brussels. Last week, another colleague of mine was in Brussels doing back-to-back congressional briefings. I was in Brussels now, and in May I will be in Paris and in Berlin. So we maintain our own relationships with elected officials, but we also partner with literally every organization out there because our issues are center stage, right? And
Mhm.
while there's many advocacy and outreach organizations, there are still very few research organizations that, on one hand, bring to the forth facts and figures. And that is our ultimate ammunition, because that is the one thing that no one can dispute. You know,
Mhm.
I was sitting in Brussels in a high-profile meeting, and a meeting that was a little bit hostile, right? Let's put it that way. And when I said to her, I said, are you aware that you gave 14 million euros to Hamas in cash, earmarked as humanitarian aid in 2024? And she says, that cannot be. You're making this up. And then I pull out my laptop and I go into the EU's, system, transparency system registrar, which is an online registrar, and I open the link and I say, well, either your link, your system is not accurate, or your team hasn't done the homework. And that is that's the ultimate weapon against the propaganda and the lies, right? And the distorted truths. But we go one step beyond that. We
Okay.
contextualize our research to and customize it basically to every country's legislative system,
Mhm.
because the appropriations process in the States has one cycle and political logics behind it, right? And a
Mhm.
political process. In Germany, that same budgetary process and in Brussels will look completely different. Certain governments have existing policies, that do a better job in being transparent, but do a poorer job in being accountable, vetting, oversight, control mechanisms, and the other way around. So we know each country's existing policies, loopholes, and then based on that, we can make concrete policy recommendations. And then the final level is that we basically apply peer pressure to them. I'll sit in Brussels and I'll say, well, the Germans already legislated this. Did you know
Uh-huh.
that? And
Mhm.
the Dutch did the same. And the Danish, already have in their contracts with every NGO such and such, such and such, such and such. And the Americans have already done that. Are you going to be the only one? So we have this document that we call it the best practices. But it's a collection of what each government has already done. And then instead of saying this is what NGO Monitor thinks you should do, we basically say your counterparts in other governments have already upped their ante, right, in terms of fighting these issues and addressing them. Are you gonna be left behind? And very often that works actually.
Did any of those governments say to you, we're thinking about clawing back some of this money that we gave to terrorists that was misappropriated?
So no government will put it in those words,
How
okay?
do they say it?
One common denominator between all governments anywhere, and it doesn't matter if they're right, left, conservative, liberal, is they don't like to say that they did anything wrong. So, no one makes mistakes in politics. That's a pre-given, but that's fine. But first of all, we have had many successes even before, but I will focus on since October the 7th because I think this is the real deal now and the real fight. So immediately after October the 7th, we put together a seemingly simple report. We screened the social media statements of a bunch of Palestinian NGOs
Hmm.
on their comments on October the 7th. I mean,
Ooh.
it probably doesn't come as a surprise to anyone in the audience that none of them condemned it.
Hmm.
Most of them glorified it.
Right.
Some of them immediately on October the 8th launched a counterattack saying this is all made up by Israel just to, justify occupying Gaza and blah, blah, the genocide, apartheid, starvation, all these libels. But we sent that report. I think I have, in the first 3 weeks after October the 7th, I think I briefed, I don't know, at least 300 members of the parliament. Like
Wow.
it was one on one, one on one. It was insane. We were working 24/7. We shared it with the European Parliament specifically. And based on that research, they froze, or should I say canceled,
Hmm.
25 million euros in funding to a bunch of Palestinian NGOs. But more importantly, they said that they will add an anti-incitement clause in their contracts with Palestinian NGOs. That teaches you two things. It did not exist before, meaning they weren't checking. But once they looked into it, they realized now we have to have it. So it was twofold. cutting funds, but more importantly, actually tightening the control mechanisms. We pushed the German government. We used the media pressure there. You have to know how, you try different places, different methods. We
Mhm.
exposed German funding to some of these terror affiliated groups through German media. And as a response, they announced that they will stop funding 6 of them that are designated by Israel as terror fronts for the Palestinian terror organization Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. In June last year, I presented a policy paper in the German parliament that it lays out how Germany on its end should condition aid, right? So it doesn't end up with terror affiliated groups. And one of the main things I said there is the gloves are off. After October the 7th, the lowest common denominator is anyone who does not recognize Israel's right to exist must not be the recipient of aid or the distributor of aid.
Oh, wow.
Behold, in November past year, the German parliament passed a resolution, which is a binding one, that says exactly that. Anyone who does not recognize Israel's right to exist will not get German funding. And they already cut funding to a few organizations. Picture this, one of these NGOs was complaining on their social media that they were summoned to the German embassy in Israel, in Tel Aviv. And
Mhm.
the embassy people sat them down and said, do you recognize Israel's right to exist? 2025. And they couldn't say yes. And then the German diplomat said, well, we then have to stop the project.
Will
It,
EU
it is
will the EU
mind-blowing.
fund it? Will the EU fund any organization that disavows Israel's right to exist? Is the EU committed to that as well? Not just Germany?
They are committed to it in political statements, but as long as you don't legislate it, as long as it's not written in a policy and in a contract, they're not really committed to it. And that is exactly where NGO Monitor resides, right? Like many people don't understand how we do things. There's a lot of itty-gritty and footnotes and reading lengthy documents. But the one thing I cannot stress this enough. We're never going to eradicate all the haters. There's always going to be people who hate. But the one thing we can do is we can regulate the public space. The difference between a white supremacist, okay, or a neo-Nazi, a skinhead, is that he knows or she that if they go public and get caught, the legal system already knows and has like laws in place that will sanction him, right? And the public will identify it as a bad thing, a speech, a hate speech, right? Violation of this and or that. When it comes to pro-Palestinian activists who chant on the streets of, New York and Dallas, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, global intifada, right? And things like that. There's no such regulation in place. And this is the space that we need to regulate, and we need to help and work with the elected officials uh, to translate big statements. It has to start with big political statements, but if it doesn't trickle down to practical policies, then we haven't really finished the work.
So it sounds as if one of your measures of success is how much funding you stop. Is that correct?
That is one of the measures, yes.
What are some other measures of your success?
So that is one of the measures, and I can tell you that in the last 5 years-ish, our research helped cut at least $150 million in governmental funding alone
Wow.
to anti-Israel NGOs. And I
Wow.
say at least because this is that the entire field is not very transparent, so you don't always even know, right? But
Right.
that is, and as impressive as it sounds, that is
It
not the
does.
biggest impact. Well, thank you. But that's not the biggest impact, because think, if you don't teach the system how it ended up funding or working or relying on a terror affiliated NGO or a anti-Semitic one, or how it ended up quoting it in an official bill, right? Then it's going to make the same mistake again, maybe not with that NGO that you just cut funding from them, but with another one. So a much more complicated process, but a much greater impact is getting them to change NGO funding policies. And that
I
is
have a question for you.
sure.
If Charity Navigator rates 501c3 charities on specific criteria, why can't NGO Monitor rate terror organizations on a scale, whether they fund anti-Israel programs, they promote propaganda, they provide false information, they associate with terrorists, or something like that. Is that on your radar? Is that a possibility?
Well, that's a really interesting idea. We don't have a rating system or a rater, but we do. If you go on our website is basically a database of you know, it's probably around 200, 250 of the most active NGOs, but we have a database of over 1,000 NGOs, and we update this on regular basis. We screen two things: what they say, and then if you go and you click, JVP on our database, you'll find bullet points after bullet point of they said this in this document with an original link to it. They wrote this and that. They called it. They signed. Then there will be a part about their staff. Who are they affiliated to? What they participated in? Have they glorified terror? And the third piece is the funding. Who funds
They're
them?
all Fs. They're all Fs on your on your website. I mean, they should all get Fs.
Well, they should. Yeah. Anyone who finds any NGO that finds its way to to our website is probably not. Even if we had a rater, would not get a very high rating.
Okay. Well, I have my last question is, what can we do to support your work to get the word out from the wonderful findings that you provide to help Israel and prevent anti-Semitism?
Well, that's an excellent question. You can do several things. Number one, you can educate yourself and educate those around you. We are only as strong as informed we are, right? If you or I or our kids go find themselves in a situation, and sadly we all find ourselves in these kind of hostile and unpleasant situations almost on daily basis after October the 7th, right? Then you're only as strong of an opponent to the person opposite of you if you're informed and armed with facts. You can, if you are affiliated or active in any one organization, you can reach out and partner with us, and we will figure out ways to use the information and use your organization as a multiplying factor, right, to raise
Mhm.
more awareness. You can be in touch with your elected officials, raising
Right.
awareness on this. You can, on a very local level, you can write letters. They actually do respond. They actually do. In the US, they actually care about when their constituency writes to them. um, and last but definitely not least, I manage an organization that is a non-for-profit organization, and as a matter of principle, we take no governmental funding because we provide critical analysis of those who do take governmental funding. If anyone has the capacity, we are always grateful if anyone wishes to support us, because the challenge is enormous, and the appetite for our research and for our analysis and for the recommendations is enormous. And this is the time to support us and all the others in this space that are fighting the fight, because it does take a village and we all have to do it together.
So donate. Well, Olga, thank you so very much for the work you do and for all this information. It's really fascinating. And we look forward to seeing you in November, face to face in
I
person in Plano, Texas. So to hear more from Olga, then it will be wonderful to host you in person. And for everyone watching now, we have our next webinar next Tuesday on the 9th with Toba Hellerstein on anti-Semitism, insights and strategies for change. So be prepared to come in November the 16th, to see Olga again in Plano, Texas for our all-day Israel Now Forum. And our website is israelnowforum.org. And bye for now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Olga.